He's known as the voice of God, the man whose mere presence transforms ordinary words into absolute truth. For decades, Morgan Freeman has narrated our dreams, guided our stories, and embodied wisdom on screen. But behind that unshakable voice lies a truth Hollywood never told you. A man who waited 50 years, 5 entire decades of brutal rejection, before receiving his first Oscar nomination, who survived extreme poverty in segregated Mississippi, where black children were taught their lives were worth less, who worked as a janitor, taxi driver, and fair dancer, while younger actors with a tenth of his talent achieved stardom. And when success finally arrived, when the world learned his name, the price of that glory revealed itself as devastating. A catastrophic accident at 71 that destroyed his left hand forever. Chronic pain that haunts him every second of every day. Public accusations that stained an image built over 8 decades. And a tragedy so brutal, 16 stab wounds, blood on the sidewalk, a granddaughter ripped from life, that not even his legendary voice can narrate it without breaking. How did an invisible boy from the Deep South become the voice that defines a generation? Why did it take half a century for the world to recognize what was always there? And what was the real cost of fame that arrived too late to prevent the tragedies still to come? Before we begin, if Morgan Freeman's work has ever moved you, inspired you, or simply made you believe in the power of storytelling, leave a like in tribute to a man who gave his entire life to the craft. Morgan Freeman was born on June 1, 1937, in Memphis, Tennessee, but his story truly begins in the cotton fields and dusty backroads of Mississippi. The Deep South in the late 1930s was not just segregated, it was a battlefield. Jim Crow laws ruled with iron fists. Black children entered through back doors, drank from separate fountains, and learned early that their lives were considered worth less than others. Morgan's father, Morgan Porterfield Freeman Sr., was a barber struggling to survive in an economy designed to crush black ambition. His mother, Mamie Edna, worked as a teacher and cleaner, taking any job that would put food on the table. But even 2 incomes weren't enough. When Morgan was still an infant, his parents made the agonizing decision that countless families faced during the Great Depression. They sent him away. He was raised primarily by his paternal grandmother in Charleston, Mississippi, a tiny town where poverty wasn't just a condition, it was the air everyone breathed. His grandmother's house had no electricity, no running water, no luxuries of any kind. Years later, Morgan would recall with brutal honesty, "We were so poor. We didn't even know we were poor." Everyone around us lived the same way. Childhood in Charleston meant picking cotton under a merciless sun for pennies a day. It meant wearing clothes stitched from flour sacks. It meant watching white children ride buses to well-funded schools, while black children walked miles to crumbling one-room buildings with outdated books and overworked teachers. Morgan learned to read in those classrooms, but he also learned something darker, that the world had already decided his worth before he ever had a chance to prove it. Racism wasn't abstract. It was the shopkeeper who refused to look him in the eye, the police officer who stopped him for walking on the wrong side of the street. The constant, suffocating understanding that one wrong word, one wrong move, could end in violence. "You learn to keep your head down," Morgan later admitted. "You learn to survive by becoming invisible." But even in that invisibility, something was stirring. At age 9, Morgan discovered acting almost by accident. In a school play, he was cast as the lead, and the moment he stepped onto that makeshift stage, something clicked. For the first time in his young life, he wasn't invisible. He wasn't poor. He wasn't just another black child the world would ignore. He was seen. He was heard. And he was powerful. The applause was small, the audience just parents and teachers, but for Morgan, it was a revelation. "I fell in love with acting that day," he would say decades later, not because of the attention, but because for the first time, I felt like I mattered. Still, dreams don't fill empty stomachs. His family moved constantly, chasing work from Mississippi to Chicago to Indiana and back again. Stability was a luxury they couldn't afford. Morgan attended multiple schools, always the new kid, always the outsider. At Broad Street High School in Greenwood, Mississippi, he joined the drama club, throwing himself into every role he could get. While other boys played football or worked after school, Morgan memorized lines, studied characters, and imagined a life beyond cotton fields and segregation. His teachers noticed. One in particular, a drama instructor whose name Morgan would carry with gratitude for the rest of his life, told him something that changed everything. "You have a gift. Don't waste it." It was the first time anyone had told him he was capable of something beyond survival. But gifts don't pay bills. When Morgan graduated high school in 1955, Hollywood felt as distant as the moon. Black actors in the 1950s were relegated to servants, slaves, and stereotypes. Sidney Poitier was only just beginning to crack the door open. For a kid from Mississippi with no money, no connections, and no clear path, becoming an actor seemed laughable. So Morgan did what millions of young men did in that era. He joined the United States Air Force, not out of patriotism, but out of necessity. It was a paycheck. It was escape. And it was, he hoped, a stepping stone to something better. He trained as a radar technician, served his country, and hated every single day of it. "I thought the Air Force would give me discipline, direction," he later confessed. "Instead, it taught me what I didn't want to be." He realized with painful clarity that following orders, living inside someone else's structure, suffocated him. Acting was the only thing that had ever felt like freedom. And if he didn't chase it now, he never would. In 1959, at 22 years old, Morgan Freeman left the Air Force and moved to Los Angeles with nothing but a duffel bag, a few dollars, and a dream that everyone told him was impossible. He had survived Mississippi. He had survived the military. Now came the hardest battle of all: surviving Hollywood. Los Angeles in 1959 should have been a dream. Palm trees, ocean breeze, the golden promise of Hollywood just over the hill. But for Morgan Freeman, a 22-year-old black man with a Southern accent and zero connections, L.A. was a cold awakening. Auditions led nowhere. Casting directors took one look and offered him the same tired roles: bellhop, janitor, criminal. The parts that didn't require a name, just a face to fill the background. He lasted less than 2 years before the rejection wore him down. If Hollywood wouldn't have him, maybe the stage would. In 1960, Morgan packed his life into a single suitcase and moved to New York City, chasing the one place where black actors had even a sliver of opportunity: theater. New York was brutal in a different way. Rent devoured his savings. Auditions were ruthless, hundreds of actors competing for a single role. And once again, the parts available to him were humiliating. Servants, slaves, nameless extras. Morgan later admitted, "I spent years being invisible on stage, just like I was invisible back in Mississippi. Only now I was invisible by choice, and that made it worse." To survive, he took any job he could find. He danced in the chorus of the 1964 World's Fair. He worked as a transcript clerk at Los Angeles City College, filing papers and answering phones. He drove a taxi through Manhattan's chaotic streets, picking up fares while mentally rehearsing monologues in traffic. Every dollar went toward rent, food, and the faint hope that the next audition would be different. But the next audition was never different. Years passed. Morgan turned 25, then 28, then 30. Friends from acting classes gave up and moved home. Others found stable jobs and abandoned the dream. Morgan kept going, but the weight of failure was crushing. He married Jeanette Adair Bradshaw in 1967, and together they raised 4 children, his stepdaughter from Jeanette's previous relationship and 3 others. Suddenly, acting wasn't just a dream. It was irresponsible. He had mouths to feed, bills stacking up, and a career that existed only in his imagination. The theater community knew his face. Directors respected his work. But respect doesn't pay rent. He bounced between off-Broadway productions, regional theater, and small experimental shows that paid almost nothing. In 1967, he finally got a break, a role in an all-black production of Hello, Dolly, on Broadway starring Pearl Bailey. It wasn't a lead, but it was Broadway. It was legitimate. It was proof that he could survive in this world. The show ran for years, and Morgan performed night after night, perfecting his craft in front of live audiences who barely noticed him. But he was learning. Watching Pearl Bailey command the stage taught him timing, presence, and the power of stillness. She didn't need to shout to be heard, Morgan recalled. That's when I learned that sometimes the quietest voice is the loudest. Still, the 1970s arrived, and Morgan was pushing 35 with little to show for 15 years of struggle. His marriage was strained. His children needed stability he couldn't provide. And the industry still saw him as expendable. He auditioned for film roles and was told his face was too intense, his voice too deep, his presence too serious. Hollywood wanted black comedians, not black Shakespearean actors. Depression crept in. There were nights Morgan sat in his tiny apartment wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake, if he should have stayed in the Air Force, taken a stable job, lived a normal life. I questioned everything, he later confessed. I thought maybe I was chasing something that was never meant for me. Then, in 1971, came a lifeline. The Electric Company, a children's educational show on PBS. It wasn't prestigious, it wasn't film, but it was steady work, a paycheck, and national exposure. Morgan played Easy Reader, a hip character who made reading cool for kids. For 5 years, he showed up, performed, and slowly built a fan base of children who had no idea their favorite TV character was a frustrated Shakespearean actor barely making ends meet. But even that felt like a trap. He was 40 years old, beloved by kindergartners, invisible to Hollywood. The dream he'd chased since age 9 felt further away than ever. The lost decade had become 2 lost decades. And time, Morgan knew, was running out. By the early 1980s, Morgan Freeman had resigned himself to a painful truth. He would never be a movie star. At 45, he was too old for leading roles, too unknown for major parts, and too proud to keep playing stereotypes. But he refused to quit. If Hollywood wouldn't come to him, he'd prove himself where it couldn't ignore him. On stage. In 1978, he joined the Shakespearean theater circuit, performing in productions of Coriolanus and Titus Andronicus. Critics began to notice. Here was an actor with gravity, with depth, with a presence that commanded attention even in silence. In 1980, he originated the role of Hoke Colburn in Alfred Urry's off-Broadway play, Driving Miss Daisy. A gentle chauffeur, navigating racial tensions in the Jim Crow South. The role was small, the production modest, but Morgan's performance was unforgettable. Theater critics raved, awards followed. And slowly, Hollywood started paying attention. Not with blockbuster offers, but with character roles, the kind reserved for actors who could elevate any scene just by being in it. In 1987, at age 50, Morgan was cast in Street Smart as Fast Black, a violent pimp opposite Christopher Reeve. It was a small film, barely seen by audiences, but Morgan's performance was volcanic, dangerous, unpredictable, terrifying. When the Oscar nominations were announced in 1988, Morgan Freeman's name appeared for the first time. Best Supporting Actor. At 50 years old, after 3 decades of invisibility, he was finally seen. He didn't win. The statue went to Sean Connery for The Untouchables, but the nomination changed everything. Suddenly, casting directors who once dismissed him were calling. Scripts arrived. Offers multiplied. Then came 1989, the year Morgan Freeman became undeniable. First, Driving Miss Daisy was adapted into a film with Jessica Tandy, reprising her stage role, and Morgan returning as Hoke. The movie became a cultural phenomenon, a quiet meditation on race, dignity, and friendship that resonated across America. Morgan's performance was the soul of the film, understated, powerful, heartbreaking. He earned his 2nd Oscar nomination, this time for Best Actor. That same year, he appeared in Glory alongside Denzel Washington and Matthew Broderick, playing Sergeant Major John Rawlins in the story of the 1st African-American Regiment in the Civil War. It was another supporting role, but Morgan made it unforgettable, lending gravitas and humanity to every scene. 2 Oscar nominations in 2 years. At 52, Morgan Freeman wasn't just working, he was thriving. But the timing stung. I spent 30 years preparing for success that came when most actors retire, he admitted years later. Part of me was grateful. Another part was angry it took so long. Hollywood loves a late bloomer story, but it rarely acknowledges the cost. Morgan had spent his prime years scraping by, raising children in uncertainty, watching younger actors leap past him. Now he was being celebrated, but the bitterness of lost time lingered. His marriage to Jeanette had crumbled under the weight of financial stress and his obsessive pursuit of acting. They divorced in 1979 after 12 years together. By the time fame arrived, he was alone. Still, he didn't slow down. He couldn't. This was the moment he'd waited for since age 9 in that Mississippi schoolhouse. In 1990, he married Myrna Colley Lee, a costume designer, hoping this time success would allow him to balance career and love. And the roles kept coming. Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, Unforgiven, The Shawshank Redemption. Morgan Freeman, the man Hollywood ignored for decades, had become one of the most sought-after actors in the world. But even as the accolades piled up, even as his voice became synonymous with authority and wisdom, a quiet dread followed him. He had spent 50 years learning that success is fragile. And he was right to be afraid. Because the hardest blows were still ahead. The 1990s belonged to Morgan Freeman, not in the explosive way stardom claims young actors, but in the quiet, undeniable way gravity pulls everything into orbit. At an age when most actors fade into character roles and nostalgia circuits, Morgan was just beginning to define what screen presence truly meant. In 1994, The Shawshank Redemption was released to modest box office numbers and lukewarm critical reception. It was considered a noble failure, a well-made prison drama that audiences simply didn't show up for. But Morgan's performance as Ellis "Red" Redding, the institutionalized inmate who narrates Andy Dufresne's journey, carried a weight that transcended the film's initial reception. His voice, measured, weary, hopeful, became the soul of the story. Years later, as Shawshank found new life on cable television and home video, it transformed into a cultural phenomenon. Consistently ranked as one of the greatest films ever made, it became inseparable from Morgan's narration. That opening line, I guess it comes down to a simple choice, really. Get busy living or get busy dying, wasn't just dialogue. It was scripture. Morgan had become the voice people trusted to tell them the truth. Hollywood noticed. In 1995, he starred in Seven opposite Brad Pitt, playing Detective Somerset, a weary veteran counting down to retirement in a world drowning in depravity. The role could have been forgettable, cynical cop, seen it before, but Morgan infused it with dignity, exhaustion, and a flicker of hope that made the film's darkness bearable. Seven became a box office hit and a thriller classic, cementing Morgan as the industry's conscience. Then came Amistad in 1997, where he played Theodore Jodson opposite Anthony Hopkins in Steven Spielberg's historical drama about the 1839 slave ship rebellion. Morgan brought quiet fury to a role that could have been reduced to noble suffering, reminding audiences that dignity and rage can coexist in the same breath. But it was 2004 that brought Morgan Freeman the recognition he'd chased for over 40 years. In $1 Million Baby, Clint Eastwood's devastating boxing drama, Morgan played Eddie "Scrap Iron" Dupree, a former boxer turned gym custodian who narrates the tragic story of Maggie Fitzgerald. Once again, his voice guided the audience through heartbreak. Once again, he made the unbearable beautiful. When the 2005 Academy Awards arrived, Morgan Freeman's name was called Best Supporting Actor. At 67 years old, after 4 nominations over 17 years, he finally held the Oscar in his hands. His acceptance speech was brief, humble, almost uncomfortable with the attention. I want to thank everybody and anybody who ever had anything to do with the making of this picture, he said simply, his voice cracking just slightly. No grand declarations, no speeches about perseverance, just gratitude. But those who knew his story understood what that statue represented. Vindication. Proof that the boy from Mississippi, the invisible soldier, the struggling theater actor, the man told he'd never make it, had not only made it, but become irreplaceable. The roles grew larger, the paychecks astronomical. Batman Begins and The Dark Knight cast him as Lucius Fox, bringing gravitas to superhero spectacle. Invictus reunited him with Eastwood, playing Nelson Mandela with such authenticity that South Africans wept. Documentaries sought him as narrator, March of the Penguins, Through the Wormhole. Because his voice didn't just describe events, it gave them meaning. He became the actor directors called when they needed someone the audience would believe without question. Playing God in Bruce Almighty and Evan Almighty wasn't typecasting, it was acknowledgement. If anyone could make divinity feel real, it was Morgan Freeman. By the late 2000s, his net worth soared past $250 million. He owned multiple properties, including a 124-acre ranch in Mississippi, returning to the state that once tried to erase him, now as a landowner, a success story, a legend. He flew his own plane, indulged in hobbies denied to him during decades of poverty, and worked only on projects that interested him. But wealth couldn't insulate him from what came next. In 2008, at the peak of his powers, fate delivered a blow so violent it would alter the rest of his life. And unlike the scripts he performed, this suffering had no narrator to make sense of it. Only pain, silence, and a body that would never be whole again. August 3, 2008. A summer night in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi. The same state where Morgan had picked cotton as a child. The same back roads where he'd once walked invisible. Now, at 71, he was returning as a legend, flying his private plane to his ranch, living the life poverty once made unimaginable. He was driving his 1997 Nissan Maxima along Highway 32 with Damaris Meyer, a close friend and business partner, in the passenger seat. The highway was dark, the kind of rural two-lane road where streetlights are rare and wildlife appears without warning. What happened next remains unclear. Some reports suggest he swerved to avoid an animal, others point to a blown tire, still others whisper he may have fallen asleep at the wheel. What is certain is this: the car veered off the road, flipped multiple times, and crumpled like paper. When rescuers arrived, they found Morgan trapped inside the wreckage, unconscious and broken. The jaws of life had to cut through twisted metal to extract him. Damaris was injured but stable. Morgan was dying. His left shoulder was shattered. His left arm hung useless. His hand, the one that had held an Oscar, signed autographs, and gestured through 1,000 performances, was crushed beyond recognition. He was airlifted to Regional Medical Center in Memphis, the same city where he'd been born 71 years earlier. Surgeons worked through the night. His shoulder required extensive reconstruction. Nerves in his arm were severed. His hand, they told him bluntly, would never fully function again. The technical term was nerve damage. The reality was simpler. His left hand was paralyzed. For weeks, Morgan lay in a hospital bed, drifting in and out of morphine-induced fog. The pain was relentless, a fire that medication could dull but never extinguish. Worse than the physical agony was the psychological realization creeping in with every dawn. This would not heal. This was permanent. At 71, his body had been irrevocably altered. When he was finally released, the world saw photographs of Morgan Freeman wearing a compression glove on his left hand, the kind used to manage nerve pain and reduce swelling. In interviews, he spoke carefully about the accident, downplaying the severity. "It's a nuisance more than anything," he told reporters, forcing a smile. But those close to him saw the truth. The man who had spent his life mastering physical expression now struggled to button a shirt, grip a pen, or perform the smallest tasks without assistance. The nerve damage triggered fibromyalgia, a chronic pain condition that floods the body with stabbing, burning sensations that have no cure. Some days were manageable. Other days, the pain was so severe Morgan could barely stand. "It's a never-ending ache," he admitted years later. "It follows me everywhere, every moment of every day." The compression glove became permanent, a visible mark of fragility on a man the world viewed as invincible. Paparazzi photographed it relentlessly. Tabloids speculated. Fans worried. And Morgan, ever private, retreated further from the public eye, appearing only when contractually obligated, smiling for cameras while his left hand throbbed beneath the fabric. But the physical damage wasn't the only scar. The accident raised uncomfortable questions. Why was Damaris Meyer in the car? Morgan was still married to Myrna Colley Lee at the time, though their relationship had grown distant. Rumors swirled that Damaris was more than a friend, whispers Morgan refused to address. The crash, meant to be a private tragedy, became public gossip fodder. The irony was cruel. Morgan had spent decades invisible in Mississippi, overlooked and dismissed. Now he returned as a broken man, his suffering analyzed and dissected by strangers. The state that once ignored him now watched him bleed. Recovery was slow and incomplete. Physical therapy restored some mobility, but the left hand remained largely useless. Simple pleasures, playing guitar, holding a grandchild securely, even shaking hands with confidence, were stolen. Acting, his life's work, became harder. Directors had to shoot around the glove. Scripts were adjusted. Scenes requiring two functional hands were rewritten or cut. And yet, Morgan kept working, not because he needed the money, but because stopping meant surrendering. In 2009, just months after the crash, he appeared in Invictus, playing Nelson Mandela, a man who endured 27 years in prison and emerged unbroken. The parallels weren't lost on Morgan. "Mandela taught me something," he said. "Pain is temporary. Dignity is forever. But dignity doesn't erase pain. It only helps you carry it." And Morgan Freeman would carry the scars of that Mississippi highway for the rest of his life, a reminder that even legends are fragile, that fate is indifferent to fame, and that some wounds never truly heal. For decades, Morgan Freeman's image was untouchable. The voice of God, the embodiment of wisdom, the elder statesman of Hollywood whose mere presence elevated any project. His reputation wasn't just clean, it was sacred. And then, in May 2018, it shattered in a single afternoon. CNN published an investigation titled "Morgan Freeman Accused of Sexual Harassment by 8 Women." The story was detailed, damning, and impossible to ignore. 8 women, production assistants, junior staff members, colleagues, came forward with allegations spanning decades. They described a pattern of unwanted touching, inappropriate comments about their bodies, and a work environment where Morgan's behavior made them feel objectified and powerless. One woman, a production assistant on Going in Style, alleged that Morgan repeatedly tried to lift her skirt and asked if she was wearing underwear. Another recalled working on his film company, Revelations Entertainment, where she claimed he would stare at her body and make comments that left her feeling violated. A senior member of the production staff described his behavior as a pattern of inappropriate advances that everyone knew about, but no one stopped. The allegations weren't isolated incidents. They painted a picture of a man who used his power and status to make women uncomfortable, who treated junior staff as objects for his amusement, who operated under the assumption that his legend granted him immunity. The report included 16 total witnesses who either experienced or observed the behavior firsthand. The response was immediate and devastating. Within hours, the hashtag #MeToo, the movement that had already toppled Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, and countless others, turned its focus on Morgan Freeman. Visa, which had just launched a campaign with Morgan as its spokesperson, pulled the ads. The Screen Actors Guild announced it would reconsider his Lifetime Achievement Award nomination. Projects were quietly shelved. Co-stars distanced themselves. Morgan issued a statement that same day. "Anyone who knows me or has worked with me knows I am not someone who would intentionally offend or knowingly make anyone feel uneasy. I apologize to anyone who felt uncomfortable or disrespected. That was never my intent." But the apology felt hollow. Critics pointed out that he acknowledged making people uncomfortable without actually denying the behavior. He expressed regret for their feelings, not for his actions. It was the kind of non-apology celebrities issue when they're caught, not when they're remorseful. Days later, he issued a second statement, this time more defensive. "I am devastated that 80 years of my life is at risk of being undermined in the blink of an eye by Thursday's media reports." The focus had shifted from the women to his legacy, from accountability to self-preservation. The damage deepened. The fallout wasn't just professional, It was existential. For a man who had spent his career playing moral authorities, judges, presidents, mentors, God himself, the accusations were a devastating inversion. The voice that narrated truth was now accused of embodying hypocrisy. The face of dignity was now associated with misconduct. Some defended him. Colleagues pointed to decades of professional behavior, arguing that the allegations, while serious, represented a small fraction of his interactions. Others noted that none of the claims involved criminal conduct, only workplace impropriety. Morgan never faced criminal charges. No lawsuits were filed. The court of public opinion became the only trial. But in the MeToo era, public opinion is unforgiving. The cultural moment demanded accountability, not nuance. And Morgan Freeman, whether guilty of intentional harassment or simply oblivious to how his behavior affected others, became a symbol of the reckoning. The untouchable had been touched. The voice of God was now human, flawed, and diminished. Work continued, but differently. He appeared in Angel Has Fallen and The Hitman's Bodyguard sequel, roles that required less of his moral authority and more of his action star credibility. Narration work dried up. Documentary producers who once begged for his voice found other options. The industry didn't blacklist him. His talent and box office value were still significant. But the reverence was gone. At home, the scandal accelerated the end of his marriage. Morgan and Myrna Colley Lee had been separated since 2007, the year before his car crash, but the divorce was finalized in 2010 after 23 years of marriage. Friends later suggested that the emotional toll of the accusations, combined with existing strains, made reconciliation impossible. By 2018, Morgan was alone, aging, and watching the legacy he'd built for 8 decades crumble in real time. The cruelest part wasn't the accusations themselves, it was the timing. Morgan was 81 years old. He had survived poverty, racism, decades of rejection, a near-fatal accident, and chronic pain. He had climbed from invisibility to icon, and now, near the end of his life, the image the world held of him, wise, dignified, untouchable, was revealed to be incomplete at best, fraudulent at worst. He retreated from the spotlight, appearing only when necessary, speaking less, smiling rarely. The man who once narrated the universe now seemed to prefer silence. And perhaps that silence was the loudest confession of all. If the 2018 allegations wounded Morgan Freeman's reputation, the event that truly broke him happened 3 years earlier, on a quiet New York street in the early hours of August 16, 2015. A tragedy so brutal, so senseless, that even his legendary composure couldn't withstand it. Adina Hines was 33 years old, vibrant, full of life. She was Morgan's step-granddaughter, the granddaughter of his first wife, Jeanette Adair Bradshaw, whom he'd helped raise since she was a child. Morgan had been a father figure to Adina throughout her life, supporting her acting ambitions, funding her education, and staying close even after his divorce from Jeanette ended in 1979. To Morgan, she wasn't just family. She was one of the few people who had known him before fame, who loved him not as a legend, but as Grandpa Morgan. That August night, Adina was outside her Washington Heights apartment with her boyfriend, Lamar Davenport. Neighbors later described hearing screaming, then seeing Davenport on top of Adina, stabbing her repeatedly in the torso and chest. Witnesses tried to intervene, shouting for him to stop. He didn't. He kept stabbing, over and over, even as Adina's life drained onto the pavement. When police arrived, Davenport was still standing over her body, the knife in his hand, muttering incoherently about exorcising demons. Adina was rushed to Harlem Hospital, but was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. She had been stabbed 16 times. The medical examiner's report was clinical. Multiple stab wounds to the chest, perforation of vital organs, massive blood loss. But no report could capture the horror of what those final moments must have been like. Morgan was in Mississippi when he received the call. Friends later said he collapsed, physically unable to process the words being spoken to him. He flew to New York immediately, arriving to a scene no grandfather should ever witness. Police tape, crime scene investigators, his granddaughter's blood still staining the sidewalk. The grief was annihilating. Morgan released a statement through his publicist. "The world will never know her artistry and talent, and how much she had to offer." Her friends and family were fortunate enough to have known what she meant as a person. Her star will continue to shine bright in our hearts, thoughts, and prayers. May she rest in peace. The words were composed, dignified, appropriate. But those who saw him in the days after said he was hollowed out. A man moving through motions because stopping meant confronting the unbearable. He canceled appearances. He withdrew from projects. The man whose voice had narrated the universe couldn't find words for his own devastation. Then came the trial. Lamar Davenport was charged with second-degree murder. His defense argued insanity, claiming he'd been suffering from drug-induced psychosis, that he believed Adina was possessed, and he was performing an exorcism. Prosecutors presented a different picture, a history of volatile behavior, substance abuse, and a relationship marked by instability. Morgan attended the trial, sitting quietly in the gallery, forced to relive his granddaughter's final moments through forensic testimony and witness accounts. He heard neighbors describe her screams. He saw crime scene photos that would haunt him forever. And he watched Lamar Davenport show no remorse, no recognition of the life he'd destroyed. In May 2018, the same month the CNN allegations would surface, Davenport was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The jury found he'd been emotionally disturbed during the killing, which reduced the charge from murder. For Morgan, the verdict felt like a second betrayal. 20 years for 16 stab wounds. 20 years for extinguishing a life that had barely begun. But the nightmare didn't end with the conviction. In one of the cruelest twists of fate, tabloids began circulating a disgusting rumor, falsely suggesting that Morgan and Adina had an inappropriate relationship. The claim was based on nothing but innuendo and malicious gossip, a fabrication designed to sell papers by exploiting grief. Morgan's lawyers issued fierce denials. Adina's mother publicly condemned the rumors as vile lies. Yet the damage was done. A man grieving his murdered granddaughter now had to defend himself against accusations that weaponized his pain. It was a violation layered on top of tragedy, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the public and the press felt entitled to dissect his suffering. The murder changed Morgan in ways success and scandal never could. Friends noticed he spoke less about the future, more about the past. His ranch in Mississippi, once a retreat, became a sanctuary he rarely left. Filming became mechanical. He showed up, delivered his lines with the same gravitas, and disappeared. The sparkle that once animated his performances, the joy that made even small roles memorable, dimmed. In interviews conducted after Adina's death, Morgan's answers about family grew shorter, more guarded. When asked about his greatest regret, he paused for a long time before saying quietly, "Not being there when it mattered most." It wasn't clear if he meant the night she was killed or the years before, but the weight in his voice suggested he carried both. Adina Hines should have outlived him. She should have had decades to pursue her acting career, to find love that didn't end in violence. to become the artist she dreamed of being. Instead, she became a statistic. One of the 1,800 women killed by intimate partners each year in America. A number so routine, it barely makes headlines unless the victim is connected to someone famous. For Morgan Freeman, she wasn't a statistic. She was the little girl who used to sit in his lap, the young woman whose ambitions he nurtured, the irreplaceable piece of his life ripped away by a violence no fame or fortune could prevent. And in losing her, he learned the cruelest lesson of all, that all the Oscars, all the accolades, all the wealth and prestige in the world are powerless against the randomness of tragedy. The car crash in 2008 didn't just shatter Morgan Freeman's left arm and shoulder. It awakened something far more insidious: fibromyalgia, a chronic condition that transforms the body into a battlefield where pain is the only constant. For most people, fibromyalgia is invisible, a ghost illness that others can't see, and therefore struggle to believe. For Morgan, wearing the compression glove on every red carpet, every interview, every public appearance, the condition was impossible to hide. Fibromyalgia doesn't announce itself with broken bones or visible wounds. It attacks from within, widespread pain that migrates through muscles, joints, and nerves without warning or mercy. Some days, Morgan woke feeling almost normal. Other days, the pain was so severe he couldn't lift his arm to brush his teeth. "It's the kind of pain that makes you not want to move," he explained in a 2012 interview. But if you don't move, it gets worse. The compression glove became both treatment and symbol. Designed to reduce swelling and manage nerve pain, it squeezed his hand constantly, a reminder with every gesture that his body had betrayed him. Fans noticed it immediately. Photographers zoomed in on it. Interviewers asked about it. And Morgan, always private about vulnerability, gave the same measured response. "It's just something I live with now." But living with it meant adjusting everything. Scripts that required physical action were declined or rewritten. Fight scenes became impossible. Even simple blocking, shaking hands, opening doors, holding props, required choreography to mask his limitations. Directors learned to shoot around the glove, favoring angles that kept his left hand out of frame, or using CGI to erase it in post-production. The psychological toll ran deeper than the physical. Morgan had spent 70 years building strength, surviving poverty, rejection, racism, and failure through sheer resilience. Now, his own body was the enemy, and there was no willpower strong enough to defeat nerve damage. "You can fight a lot of things," he admitted quietly. "You can't fight your own body." Sleep became elusive. Fibromyalgia triggers insomnia, and the chronic pain kept him awake through long Mississippi nights, staring at ceilings, counting hours until dawn when he could pretend normalcy. Medication helped, but never eliminated the pain. Physical therapy maintained mobility, but couldn't restore what was lost. And every year brought new reminders that he was aging in a body that had already broken once and might break again. By his mid-80s, Morgan moved slower, spoke softer, and appeared in public less frequently. The ranch in Mississippi, once a symbol of triumph, became a refuge where he didn't have to perform strength he no longer felt. Friends visited less often. Projects were selected not for artistic merit, but for physical feasibility. And the man whose voice had once narrated entire universes now spent most days in silence, accompanied only by pain and the ghosts of what used to be possible. Fibromyalgia hadn't just damaged his body. It had stolen his future. The retirement he'd imagined, the freedom he'd earned, the peace he deserved after 8 decades of fighting. Instead, he was sentenced to a life where every movement carried a price, and the only question was how much it would cost today. In 2025, Morgan Freeman is 87 years old. The compression glove remains. The fibromyalgia persists. The left hand that once held an Oscar still hangs mostly useless at his side. He moves slowly now, his gait careful, every step measured to avoid triggering pain that medication can only dull, never eliminate. His Mississippi ranch, a sprawling sanctuary of 124 acres, is where he spends most of his time, far from cameras, red carpets, and the relentless scrutiny that comes with legend status. He converted part of the property into a bee sanctuary, 26 hives producing honey, a quiet hobby that requires patience and stillness, two things age and pain have forced him to master. Bees don't care about Oscars, he said. They just want you to be present. Financially, Morgan remains secure. His net worth hovers around $250 million, built not just from acting, but from smart investments, real estate, and decades of narration work that continues to generate residuals. He owns properties across the country, drives when his hand allows, and occasionally flies his private plane on good days when pain levels permit. But he works less. The roles that come now are carefully selected. Voice work mostly, where his physical limitations don't matter, and that unmistakable voice can still command 6 figures for a few hours in a recording booth. He appeared in A Good Person in 2023, a small indie drama, delivering a performance that reminded audiences why he's irreplaceable. Not because of grand gestures, but because of the weight he brings to silence, the way his presence alone can fill a scene. Yet the public sees him differently now. The MeToo allegations haven't been forgotten. Adina's murder left a permanent shadow. The compression glove is a constant reminder of fragility. The voice of God has become the voice of a mortal man, flawed and finite. And perhaps that's the truest legacy. Morgan Freeman's story was never about perfection. It was about persistence. A boy born into segregation who refused to stay invisible. An actor rejected for 30 years who kept showing up. A man broken by accident and tragedy who kept working. A legend accused and diminished who kept breathing. He didn't get his first Oscar nomination until 50. Didn't win until 67. Didn't become truly wealthy until most people retire. And now, at 87, he faces what everyone faces eventually. The slow withdrawal from a world that once needed him desperately and now moves on without noticing. But the voice endures. In Shawshank Redemption, playing on screens somewhere every single day. In documentaries narrating mysteries we'll never fully understand. In the memories of millions who heard him speak and believed, if only for a moment, that wisdom and dignity still existed in the world. Morgan Freeman taught us that success can come late and still matter. That pain doesn't disqualify you from purpose. That legends are built not in moments of glory, but in decades of refusal to quit, and that even voices we think will last forever eventually fade to silence, leaving only the echo of what they once meant. Share your reflections below. What story from Morgan's journey resonates most with you? Subscribe for more untold chapters of the legends who shaped our world. And remember, behind every voice we trust, there's a human being who fought, fell, and rose again. Not because they were perfect, but because they refused to disappear.